The first time I saw the light beneath Blackwater Lake, I thought someone had dropped a flashlight into the water. It was late September, near the end of the tourist season. I was 27 years old and had recently moved to a small mountain town in northern Vermont. I worked remotely, which meant I could spend most of my evenings wherever I wanted, and I quickly developed a habit of driving out to the lake after work. Blackwater Lake was not particularly famous. There were no large resorts, no busy marinas, and no restaurants along the shore. Most people in the area knew it as a quiet place for fishing, kayaking, and camping. That was exactly why I liked it. During the summer, the lake could get moderately busy during the day, but after sunset, almost everyone disappeared. The surrounding forest became completely silent, and the surface of the water became so still that the reflection of the mountains looked almost artificial. I usually went there alone. I would park near an old gravel access road, walk down to the shore, sit on a flat rock, and listen to the water. There was something about being alone beside a large body of dark water that helped me clear my head. One Thursday night, I arrived shortly after 11. The moon was barely visible through a layer of thin clouds, but there was enough ambient light for me to see the shoreline. I turned off my car, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and walked toward the water. Everything seemed normal. No wind, no insects, no distant voices, just the occasional sound of water touching the rocks. I sat down and spent several minutes staring across the lake. Then I noticed a small white light. It was somewhere near the center of the lake. At first, I assumed it belonged to a boat. That would not have been unusual. There were occasionally fishermen out there early in the morning or late in the evening. But this light was different. It was not moving across the surface. It was simply there. I watched it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it disappeared. I figured the person on the boat had turned off their light. A few seconds later, it appeared again, except now it was slightly closer. I leaned forward. The light vanished. Then it appeared farther to the left. I remember laughing quietly because I thought I was watching someone mess around with a powerful flashlight. I even stood up and waved. The light remained completely still. Then it moved straight downward. Not toward me, not away from me. Down. It seemed to sink beneath the surface. I stared at the exact location. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then the light appeared again. This time, it was underwater. I could see it through the dark surface of the lake. That was when I became uncomfortable. The light was not reflecting on the water. It was underneath it. A pale white glow was visible, perhaps 10 feet below the surface, moving slowly through the darkness. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe a diver, maybe some kind of submerged equipment, maybe a fishing light attached to a line. The lake was deep in places, and I knew there were old structures beneath the water from before the surrounding area had been developed. So I stayed. I watched the light move beneath the surface. It traveled slowly from one side of the lake toward the other. Then it stopped. I waited. Nothing. I was about to leave when the light suddenly moved directly toward the shore. It traveled so quickly that I instinctively stepped backward. The glow stopped roughly 20 feet from where I stood. Then it went completely dark. I stood there for several seconds. I could hear my own breathing. I looked around the shoreline. There was nobody else. Then I heard something beneath the water. It sounded like 3 soft knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. The sound came from directly in front of me. I waited. 3 more knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I have no idea why, but my first thought was that someone was trapped underwater. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I pointed it toward the lake. The beam disappeared into the darkness after only a few feet. There was no sign of anything. I called out, "Is someone out there?" No answer. I waited another few seconds. Then something tapped against the rocks beside my feet. I looked down. A small object had washed onto the shore. It looked like a metal key. I picked it up. It was cold. Much colder than the surrounding air. There was something engraved on it, but I could not read it in the darkness. I decided that was enough. I walked quickly back to my car. I did not look behind me. The entire drive home, I kept telling myself that I had witnessed some strange but perfectly ordinary event. The next morning, I examined the key. It was old. Extremely old. There was a number stamped into one side. 17. I searched online for information about Blackwater Lake. I discovered that the lake had once been considerably smaller. Decades earlier, a small hydroelectric project had been constructed nearby, and part of the valley had been flooded. Several buildings had been demolished before the water rose. One of the structures had been an old ranger station. According to a local historical website, the station had been numbered 17. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I laughed at myself. There was probably some completely normal explanation. Someone had found an old key underwater. The light could have been a diver. The knocking could have been rocks moving beneath the surface. Everything had an explanation. I believed that for about 2 weeks. Then I returned to the lake. I went during the afternoon this time. I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing unusual about the place. I walked along the shoreline and found the same rock where I had been sitting. The lake looked completely ordinary. There were people fishing several hundred yards away. A family was kayaking near the opposite shore. Nothing felt strange. I almost felt embarrassed about the whole thing. Then I noticed something carved into the rock beneath me. It was a number, 17. I immediately stood up. The carving looked old, much older than the key. I photographed it and searched for information about the old ranger station. The historical records mentioned that the building had been abandoned before the valley was flooded. There was one detail that caught my attention. The ranger station had not been demolished. It had been relocated. At least, that was what the official record said. The problem was that I could not find any record explaining where it had gone. I spent the next several days thinking about it. Eventually, curiosity won. I bought a cheap, waterproof flashlight and a small action camera. I had no diving experience, so I had no intention of going deep into the lake. I simply wanted to swim a short distance from shore during daylight and see if there was anything beneath the surface. I went back on a Saturday morning. The weather was perfect. The water was unusually clear. I attached the camera to a small float and lowered it into the lake. For the first several minutes, I saw nothing. Rocks, plants, a few fish. Then the bottom dropped away. The water became darker. I slowly lowered the camera. At approximately 20 feet, the image became difficult to see. At 30 feet, almost everything disappeared into darkness. I continued anyway. Then I saw something. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree. It was a long, horizontal shape lying on the lake floor. I moved the camera closer. It was a wooden wall. I stared at the screen. There were windows. Then a doorway. It was a building. I suddenly remembered the ranger station. I moved the camera toward the structure. The wooden walls were covered in algae, but the shape was unmistakable. I could see a faded number above the doorway. 17. I pulled the camera upward immediately. My hands were shaking. I had just found the old ranger station. The official records had been wrong, or incomplete. I packed everything into my car and drove home. That should have been the end of it. Instead, I made the mistake of watching the footage that night. The first few minutes showed exactly what I expected. Then I reached the part where the building appeared. I slowed the footage down. I increased the brightness. I watched the doorway. There was nothing unusual. Then I noticed movement inside one of the windows. I paused the video. There was a pale shape behind the glass. I played it again. The shape moved. Very slowly. It looked like a person standing inside the building. I watched the footage at least 20 times. The figure remained in exactly the same place. Then, on the final replay, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The figure was not inside the building. It was standing outside. It was behind the camera. I stopped the video. I looked at the timestamp. The footage continued for another 11 minutes after I had first seen the building. I watched those 11 minutes, frame by frame. The camera moved slowly through the water. Nothing appeared. Then, near the end, the light changed. A faint glow appeared behind the camera. The same white light I had seen on the lake that night. It moved closer. Then the camera turned. For a fraction of a second, the screen showed the reflection of a face. I could not identify the person. The image was distorted by the water, but I could see two eyes. They were looking directly into the camera. I shut the laptop. I did not sleep that night. The following morning, I deleted the footage. At least, I thought I did. 2 days later, I received a notification from my cloud storage. A new video had been uploaded. I opened it. It was the same footage, except the final minute was different. The camera was no longer underwater. It was sitting on the shore. The angle showed my car in the distance, and beside the camera stood a person. They were facing the lake. I watched the figure for several seconds. Then it turned around. It was me, wearing the same clothes I had been wearing that morning. But I was not standing beside the camera. I was sitting at home when the video was recorded. The figure looked directly toward the camera. Then it raised one hand. It pointed toward the lake. The screen went black. I never returned to Blackwater Lake. I also stopped going anywhere near large bodies of water at night. For months, I convinced myself that the video had been corrupted somehow. A technical error, a strange reflection, an elaborate coincidence. I needed to believe that. Then, about 6 months later, I moved to another state. I changed my phone number. I deleted the old cloud account. I stopped talking about the lake. I thought I had finally left the whole thing behind. Until one night, almost a year after I had moved, I woke up because I heard 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. They were coming from my bedroom window. I lived on the 4th floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing outside the window except open air. I stayed completely still. 3 more knocks came from the glass. Knock, knock, knock. I slowly turned toward the window. There was a faint white light outside. It was hovering several feet beyond the glass, and beneath it, reflected in the window, was the surface of a lake. I knew that could not be real. I knew there was no lake anywhere near my apartment. But the reflection was there. The water was perfectly still, and somewhere beneath it, something was moving upward. Then the light disappeared. The reflection vanished. The window became completely normal again. I never heard the knocking after that night. But every September, when the nights begin getting colder, I still find myself thinking about Blackwater Lake. And sometimes I wonder about the old ranger station. Because there is one question I never managed to answer. If the building was supposed to have been relocated before the valley was flooded, why was there still a door underwater? And more importantly, why did someone inside it know exactly where I was? This happened about 5 years ago, when I was 29. At the time, I was working as a regional sales representative for a company that supplied equipment to small hardware stores. It was not an exciting job, but it required a lot of driving. Most weeks, I would spend 3 or 4 nights on the road, staying in whatever motel was closest to the next town on my schedule. I had stayed in dozens of cheap motels over the years. Some were surprisingly comfortable, others were barely worth the money. But there was one place I stayed at that I still think about whenever I have to sleep somewhere unfamiliar. It was called the Briarwood Motel. It was located along an old highway outside a small town in western Pennsylvania. The motel looked like it had been built sometime in the 1970s and had never been renovated. There were 2 long buildings facing a cracked parking lot. The office was a small wooden structure between them. The sign above the entrance had several letters missing, so at night it simply read, Briarwood. I remember thinking it looked like the kind of place used in horror movies. I almost did not stop there, but it was raining heavily that evening, and I had already driven for almost 6 hours. I was exhausted. I pulled into the parking lot around 11:30 at night. There were only 3 other cars. I walked into the office. An older man was sitting behind the front desk watching television. He looked up and asked if I needed a room. I said yes. He handed me a key. Room 14. Then he gave me a strange warning. He told me that the television in room 14 did not work. I laughed and told him that was fine. I rarely watch television anyway. He did not laugh. He simply said, good. Then he looked back at the television in the office. I thought that was odd. but I was too tired to care. I carried my bag to the room. Room 14 was near the end of the building. The hallway smelled like old carpet and cleaning chemicals. Inside, the room was exactly what I expected. A bed, a small table, a bathroom, an old television mounted on the wall, and a window overlooking the parking lot. I dropped my bag beside the bed and took a shower. Afterward, I climbed into bed and turned off the lights. I was asleep within minutes. At least, I thought I was. At approximately 2:17 in the morning, I woke up. I had no idea what had awakened me. The room was completely dark. For several seconds, I just stared at the ceiling. Then I heard a sound, a soft knocking. It was coming from the wall beside my bed. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. I sat up. I immediately assumed it was another guest. Maybe someone had accidentally bumped the wall. I waited. Nothing. Then it happened again. Knock. 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 This time, it sounded closer. I turned on the bedside lamp. The knocking stopped. I waited for a few seconds. Nothing. I got out of bed and placed my hand against the wall. It felt normal. I knocked on it once. There was no response. I laughed quietly at myself. I was exhausted. I had probably heard something from the plumbing. I went back to bed. Then someone knocked on the door. 1 knock. I froze. Another knock. I looked at the clock. 2:19. I did not answer. A third knock came. Then a woman's voice said, "Excuse me." It was quiet, almost a whisper. I walked toward the door. I looked through the peephole. There was nobody there. The hallway was empty. I stepped back. The woman spoke again. "Can you open the door?" I stood completely still. I could hear her breathing on the other side. Slow. Quiet. Close. I did not open the door. I asked who she was. There was a long pause. Then she said something that I still remember word for word. "I'm in the wrong room." I thought that was strange. I told her she needed to go back to the office. She did not respond. I looked through the peephole again. The hallway was still empty. I waited another minute. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself she had left. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. For the next hour, I kept listening. Nothing happened. Eventually, I must have drifted off. The next morning, I asked the man at the front desk about the woman. He looked at me. "What woman?" I explained what happened. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me what time it happened. I told him. 2:17. His expression changed. Only slightly, but I noticed. He looked down at the desk. Then he asked, "Did she say anything else?" I told him about the wrong room. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "No." I asked what that meant. He said there was no other guest in the hallway. I told him I knew that. I had looked through the peephole. He nodded. Then he gave me a strange look and asked whether I had heard knocking from the wall. I said yes. He immediately stopped talking. I asked him why. He said, "You should leave." I thought he was joking. He was not. I asked if there was some problem with the room. He told me there was no problem. Then he returned my deposit and told me not to worry about the room. I drove away. I assumed the whole thing had been some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe another guest had been confused. Maybe someone had been sleepwalking. Maybe I had imagined part of it. I forgot about the motel for several months. Then, one winter afternoon, I had another business trip in the same area. I remembered the Briarwood Motel. I almost laughed when I saw the highway exit. For some reason, I decided to look for the place. I wanted to prove to myself that I had exaggerated the experience. I found the motel. But it looked different. The sign was gone. The parking lot was empty. There was a chain across the entrance. The office windows were covered with plywood. The entire place looked abandoned. I pulled over and searched for information on my phone. The motel had been closed for almost 7 years. I stared at the screen. That could not be right. I had stayed there less than a year earlier. I searched again. Same result. The Briarwood Motel had closed after a fire. The fire had happened 7 years before my stay. I thought the article must have been wrong. Then I found another source. A local newspaper article from the time of the fire. It said the motel had been empty for months before the fire. The owner had died the previous year. The property had been scheduled for demolition. I read the article several times. Then I noticed something else. The motel had not had a front desk employee for years. The owner had been the last person who worked there. And according to the article, he had died in room 14. I immediately looked at the photograph attached to the article. It showed the motel shortly before demolition. 2 buildings, the office between them, and a row of room numbers. I zoomed in. There was room 14. I recognized the window. I recognized the curtains. I recognized the television mounted on the wall. I felt sick. I drove home. I did not tell anyone. For a while, I convinced myself there had been some kind of mistake. Maybe the motel had reopened under new management. Maybe the article was about a different Briarwood. Maybe the dates were wrong. I wanted to believe anything except what the evidence suggested. Then I remembered the key. I had kept it. Most motels use plastic key cards, but Briarwood had given me an old metal key. I had tossed it into a drawer at home. That night, I searched for it. I found it exactly where I remembered leaving it. A small brass key. Number 14. I put it on my desk. Then I noticed something. There was writing on the back. I had never seen it before. 3 words. Wrong room again. I stared at the key for several minutes. I did not sleep that night. The following day, I called the local police department. I explained that I had stayed at the motel. I told them about the man at the front desk. The officer listened politely. Then he asked me for the date. I gave it to him. He was silent. Finally, he said, "Sir, are you certain about that date?" I said yes. He checked something. Then he asked whether I had entered the building. I told him yes. He asked whether I had spoken to anyone. I said yes. He asked me to describe the man. I did. The officer did not say anything for several seconds. Then he told me the person I had described was the former owner of the motel, the same man who had died in room 14. I hung up shortly afterward. I never called again. But that was not the end. About 3 months later, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed room 14. The photograph had clearly been taken recently. The room looked exactly as I remembered it. The same bed, the same lamp, the same television, the same curtains, everything. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message. "You left something behind." I checked my belongings. Nothing was missing. I threw the photograph away. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This time, there was no photograph. There was only the brass key, number 14. I had left the key in my desk drawer. I had not told anyone where it was. I called the police again. They told me there was nothing they could do without evidence that someone was harassing me. I understood. I probably would have said the same thing if I were them, so I threw the key away. I made sure it was gone, or so I thought. The following night, I woke up at 2:17. I was lying in my own bedroom. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modern building. There was no motel anywhere nearby. I stared at the clock. 2:17. Then I heard 3 knocks. They came from the wall beside my bed. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up. My heart started racing. Another 3 knocks. Then I heard a woman's voice, very softly. "Excuse me." I did not move. The voice came again. "Can you open the door?" I looked toward my bedroom door. It was closed. I knew there was nobody outside. I lived alone. Then something slid underneath the door. A small brass key. It stopped in the middle of the floor. I did not touch it. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I moved out of the apartment. I stayed with a friend for several weeks. Eventually, nothing else happened. The knocking stopped. The voice never returned. I started believing that perhaps the entire experience had been some kind of stress-related hallucination. Then, years later, I found an old local archive online. Someone had digitized photographs from the Briarwood Motel. I opened the collection. There were dozens of photographs. Most were ordinary. The rooms, the parking lot, the office, the old highway. Then I found one photograph taken shortly before the motel closed. It showed the hallway outside room 14. Standing at the end of the hallway was the owner. He was looking directly toward the camera, and beside him stood a woman. I recognized her immediately. She was the voice I had heard outside my door. I zoomed in. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress. Her face was pale, and she was standing in front of a door. Room 14. I read the description beneath the photograph. It said the photograph had been taken 3 days before the owner's death. The woman in the photograph had been identified as his daughter. She had died 20 years earlier. The archive included one final note. According to local records, she had died in room 14, the same room where her father later died. I stopped researching after that. I have never stayed in a roadside motel since. Whenever I travel, I make sure I book a large hotel with several floors and plenty of people around. I know that sounds irrational. Maybe it is. But there is one thing I still cannot explain. The night I stayed at Briarwood Motel, the woman told me she was in the wrong room. I always assumed she meant that she had mistaken my room for hers, but now I think I understand what she meant. She was not trying to get into my room. She was trying to get out of hers. And whatever was keeping her there may have been waiting for someone else to take the room. Someone like me. Someone who would hear 3 knocks in the middle of the night. Someone who would answer. I never opened the door. That may be the only reason I am able to tell this story. This happened about 3 years ago during a road trip through northern Montana. I was 31 at the time and had taken a week off work because I desperately needed a break. My original plan was simple. Drive north, spend a few days hiking, stay in cheap motels, then come home. I was traveling alone. For the first few days, everything went exactly as planned. The weather was clear, the roads were mostly empty, and the scenery was incredible. One afternoon, I decided to take an older highway instead of the main interstate. It added almost 2 hours to the drive, but I wanted to see some of the smaller towns along the way. The road was almost completely empty. For long stretches, I could drive for 20 or 30 minutes without seeing another vehicle. There were forests on both sides. Occasionally, the trees opened up, and I could see enormous fields stretching toward distant mountains. It was peaceful. A little too peaceful, maybe. Around sunset, I passed a sign. Mile marker 41. There was a small gravel pullout nearby. I remember stopping because I wanted to take a photograph of the mountains. There was no cell service. I got out of the car and walked toward the edge of the road. That was when I heard a woman's voice. "Excuse me." I turned around. Nobody was there. I looked toward the forest. Nothing. Then I heard it again. "Excuse me." The voice sounded close. Very close. I walked around the car. Still nothing. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I assumed I had imagined it. I took my photograph and got back into the car. As I started the engine, I heard the voice again. This time it came through my car speakers. "Please stop." I immediately turned off the radio. The speakers went silent. I stared at the dashboard. Then the voice came again. "Please stop." I pulled my phone from my pocket. There was no call, no notification, nothing. The voice sounded like it was coming from the car itself. I turned the engine off. Silence. I started it again. Nothing. I decided to leave. I drove away from mile marker 41. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then my phone rang. The caller identification showed my own phone number. I stared at it. I did not answer. The call stopped. A few seconds later, it rang again. Same number. I rejected the call. Then a voicemail notification appeared. I opened it. The message was 6 seconds long. At first, there was only static. Then I heard my own voice. "Please stop." I nearly dropped the phone. I replayed it. It was unmistakably my voice. I had never recorded myself saying those words. I pulled onto the shoulder. I sat there for several minutes, trying to understand what I had just heard. Then another voicemail appeared. This one was longer. I played it. There was wind. Then a woman's voice. "Do not continue past the bridge." I looked at the road ahead. There was a bridge about a mile in front of me. I had not noticed it before. I considered turning around. Instead, I convinced myself that someone was playing a prank. Maybe I had accidentally connected to another device. Maybe there was some strange radio interference. Maybe the whole thing was a coincidence. I continued driving. The bridge appeared. It was old. A narrow concrete bridge crossing a deep ravine. There were no guardrails on the sides beyond the standard metal barriers. I slowed down. As I reached the middle, my headlights briefly illuminated something standing beside the road. A woman. She was facing away from me. She wore a long gray coat. I slammed on the brakes. The car stopped. The woman was gone. I looked in the mirrors. Nothing. I got out. The road was empty. There were no footprints, no vehicle, no place for anyone to hide. Then I heard a sound underneath the bridge. A woman's voice. Please. I stepped toward the edge. I looked down. The ravine was much deeper than I expected. There was a narrow stream at the bottom, and beside the stream was a vehicle. It looked like an old pickup truck. I could not see anyone around it. I called the police. The dispatcher asked for my location. I gave her the highway and mile marker. She asked whether anyone was injured. I told her I did not know. She said officers would be sent. I waited beside the road. 20 minutes passed. No police. 30 minutes. Still nothing. Then my phone rang. My own number. Again. This time, I answered. There was silence. Then I heard my own voice. Do not tell them about the bridge. I hung up. I immediately started the car. I drove away. I did not wait for the police. I drove for nearly an hour before reaching a town. I checked into a motel. The person at the front desk noticed that I was shaken. She asked whether I needed medical assistance. I said no. I just wanted a room. She gave me room 23. I went upstairs. I locked the door. I checked the window. I checked the bathroom. Then I sat on the bed. I was exhausted. Eventually, I fell asleep. At 3:12 in the morning, someone knocked on my door. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up. I did not move. Then the woman's voice came from the hallway. Please open the door. I recognized it immediately. It was the same voice from the road. I walked toward the door. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I stepped backward. The voice came again. Please open the door. I asked who she was. There was a long silence. Then she said, You already did. I froze. The room suddenly felt much colder. I looked toward the door. There was something beneath it. A photograph. Someone had pushed it underneath the door. I picked it up. It showed the bridge. The photograph had been taken from the middle of the road. My car was visible in the distance. I was standing beside it. The woman was standing near the bridge, but there was something wrong. She was facing the camera. I could see her face. It was pale and completely expressionless. I turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back. 41. I dropped it. Then the knocking began again. 3 knocks. This time, they were coming from the window. I turned. The motel room was on the 2nd floor. There was no balcony. Nobody could be outside. Another 3 knocks. I did not sleep. At sunrise, I left. I drove directly to the nearest police station. I told an officer everything. He listened. Then I mentioned mile marker 41. His expression changed. He asked me to repeat the location. I did. He walked away and spoke to another officer. They looked at me several times. Finally, the first officer returned. He told me there had been an accident at that bridge almost 12 years earlier. A woman had driven off the road. Her vehicle had landed in the ravine. She died before anyone found her. Her body had not been discovered for almost 2 days. I asked whether her name was known. He said yes. Then he told me something that made my stomach tighten. Her name was Evelyn Mercer. I asked him whether she had been wearing a gray coat. He stared at me. He asked why I would know that. I told him I had seen a woman near the bridge. He did not answer. Instead, he pulled up an old photograph. It showed Evelyn Mercer. She was wearing a gray coat. I recognized her. It was the woman from the road. The officer told me the investigation had found one unusual detail. The woman's phone had continued making outgoing calls after the accident. Calls to random numbers. Most had gone unanswered. But several people had reported receiving calls from her number during the 2 days before her body was found. One of those calls had been made to a highway maintenance worker. He answered. According to his report, a woman had said, "Please stop." Then the call ended. I asked what happened after that. The officer said the maintenance worker had driven to the bridge. He found nothing. I asked whether there had been any other reports. He said there had. Several. All from the same stretch of highway. I left the police station that afternoon. I never took that highway again. For months, nothing happened. Eventually, I started thinking about the experience less and less. Then one evening, I was driving home from work. My phone rang. I glanced at the screen. My own number. I immediately pulled over. The phone stopped ringing. A voicemail appeared. I did not want to listen. But I did. There was static. Then a woman's voice. "Please stop." I deleted the voicemail. Another appeared immediately. This time, it was my own voice. "Do not cross the bridge." I deleted that one too. A third voicemail appeared. I never opened it. Instead, I turned off my phone. I changed my number the next day. That was 3 years ago. Nothing has happened since. At least, nothing that I can prove. But I still have the photograph. I never threw it away. I keep it inside an old box in my closet. I do not know why. Maybe part of me wants proof that the whole thing happened. Maybe part of me wants to understand it. Last winter, I finally looked at the photograph again. I had not seen it in years. I noticed something I had somehow missed before. The photograph showed the bridge from the road. My car was in the distance. The woman was standing near the edge. But there was another person in the photograph. Someone standing behind my car. I could barely make out the figure. It looked like a man. He was facing the camera. I zoomed in. I recognized him. It was me, except I was already standing beside the bridge. There were 2 versions of me in the same photograph. One beside the car, one near the bridge. I stared at it for a long time. Then I noticed the timestamp printed at the bottom. The photograph had supposedly been taken at 3:12 in the morning. That was the exact time someone had knocked on my motel door. I checked the original file. The timestamp had not been edited. I still do not know who took that photograph. I do not know how it appeared beneath my motel door. And I do not know why my own voice kept warning me not to continue. But there is one thing I know. The next time I hear someone say, "Please stop," from an empty road, I will stop. I just hope it is not too late.